that down?
Yes, sure.
Thank you, Barry. It's a great privilege to share a platform with you and Johan and Patrick. And it's also a wonderful opportunity to pay tribute to the Bruges Group, which was founded to carry through the message Mrs. Thatcher gave in her Bruges speech. On the day of that speech, I was in Cyprus, representing Britain at a meeting of the Commonwealth Finance Ministers. I was then the Financial Secretary to the Treasury. And the news came through in the early morning of her speech, and there was consternation, not just in the chancelleries of Europe, but throughout the foreign offices of the world. And as all the Commonwealth Finance Ministers gathered together, they turned to me and said, "What does this mean? What does this speech mean? We don't understand." And I said, "But surely you understand. All of you represent countries which at some stage have gained or regained their independence. Mrs. Thatcher is simply saying that Britain wants to get back the powers to govern ourselves." "Ah," they said, "now we understand." And since the 23rd of June, even some of our own commentariat are beginning to understand that Brexit means independence. Nobody in Cyprus asked me, "What does independence mean?" They all knew it meant that you were a government, you would have a government that you chose, which would have the power to set your laws through its parliament, to control your money and to control your borders. And that's what the British people chose on the 23rd. Now, before I get down to my remarks, I must rebut a misleading statement in the biographies of speakers, which may be on your chairs before you. It says, according to Peter Lilley, Brexit is an interminable process. The haunting last couplet of the Eagles' hit California, which you will hum nightly, I'm sure, before you go to bed, the Eagles' hit California has been likened to leaving the EU. Goes, you can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. Actually, I did quote this couplet, but I said it was wrong, that the Brexit process need not be interminable, and I invoked another line in that song which said, "We are all prisoners of our own device." And it's only if we want to be prisoners that the process will take a long time. And we should also remember the other Eagles hit, which is on your minds, "Get Over It." That is a message I deliver to the Remoaners. But I distinguish between Remoaners and Remain voters. I represent a constituency which, as far as we can tell, because the votes weren't counted on a constituency basis, voted to remain. And I respect my voters who voted to remain. They're good, patriotic, intelligent, thoughtful people. But a great many of them were afraid, and I think their fears were perfectly reasonable, that voting to leave would cause a long and dangerous period, damaging period of uncertainty. And they said beforehand, "We don't want a long and damaging period of uncertainty, so we're voting to remain." Sorry, voting to leave would cause a long period. Now that we've left, they're saying we're afraid that a long and damaging period of uncertainty would be bad for the economy, so let's go on and do it quickly. And that's what we ought to be thinking about. How do we expedite this process while doing it thoroughly and reflecting all the interests and complexities involved? I think we can speed up the process if we approach it rationally and don't get bogged down in all the propaganda that was put out before about how difficult it is. The first step is to distinguish between the issues that arise as we leave, which are matters for decision by the British government, and issues which are matters for negotiation with our European neighbours. And then we get on and make the decisions which are matters for decision by the British government, which has two great advantages. It then reduces uncertainty as far as those areas of decision-making are concerned, and it reduces the scope for potential negotiation, simplifying the negotiating process, meaning we can get on with it more rapidly. Now, among the decisions for that are within the power of the issues which are within the power of the British government to decide are, first of all, the position of European Union citizens who came to this country to work legally and exercising a right which they had as members of the European Union. I think we should get on and say, you will continue to have that right to stay. No party in Britain proposes to expel you. No party on the continent proposes to expel British citizens there. But even if they did, that would be a horrifying and repugnant thing to do, and not something that we would want to retaliate with in kind. When Uganda expelled all British passport holders, we didn't for a moment even hint that we would expel Ugandan passport holders from Britain. So let's give those people who came here, who are now our neighbours, our friends, our work colleagues, the certainty that they can stay, and their employers the certainty that that will continue. But then, of course, we will need to bring in laws for newcomers from whatever date we make this announcement, and we should get on and do that too. And then we've taken out of the area of negotiation the issue of free movement and immigration rules, which are a matter for the British government and not a matter for negotiation with our neighbours, and I'll come back to that issue later. So once we've taken the decisions where we can take them, we come to the issues which are a matter of negotiation. And actually what sort of things that are envisaged by the EU when the Article 50 was written are things like who's responsible for paying the pensions of British citizens who are employed by the EU in future, when do we cease to pay a contribution and when do we cease to receive payments from the EU, who's liable for which liabilities, who owns which assets. The sort of housekeeping things that occur when people have been cohabiting, and we weren't married, by the way, we were cohabiting, leave and split up their household. But the major issue that arises once we've simplified matters is simply what our trading relationship should be with the rest of Europe. And there are only two realistic options. Once we've ruled out, effectively, membership of the European Economic Area. That was ruled out by the Remain side during the campaign. They said it would be the worst possible option, worst of all worlds. It's been ruled out by the government since, because the government said that we are going to take back control of our borders and you can't belong to the European Economic Area if you don't accept free movement of people within it. And it would be wrong because it would involve a huge cost. If you are members of the European Economic Area, not only do you have to pay a contribution, but a greater cost still, that you cannot make trade agreements with the rest of the world in services, even if you can, to some extent, in goods. And since roughly half of all our value-added exported is in services, that would be to tie our hands behind our backs and a foolish loss of an opportunity. So we've ruled that out, all sides have ruled that out. That leaves only two realistic opportunities. One is to continue the status quo, trading with our European partners without any tariffs and without any new barriers to trade in services. And the other is to trade as to the EU's three biggest trade partners, America, China and Russia, on the basis of WTO tariffs. And of course they might want to re-erect barriers, or try to re-erect barriers against our service industries. Those are the only two realistic options. The two things to recognise. First, both are very simple. To negotiate the continuation of tariffless trade, the status quo, is very simple. To go from no tariffs to no tariffs, I could do in an afternoon. The BBC, of course, constantly invokes the fact that it took 7 years to negotiate the Canadian EU free trade area. They started off with 10,000 different tariff lines on each side of the Atlantic. And they had to trade off one against another, and behind those tariffs were protected industries which were saying, oh, we don't want our tariff reduce another one, and so on, or reduce it more slowly. We don't start from that position. We start from a position of no tariffs, and it can be easily agreed in an afternoon to continue that if we want to. Obviously, once we start negotiating free trade agreements with the rest of the world, the EU will perfectly reasonably want to introduce what are called rules of origin to ensure that people don't find their way into the European market via our market and avoid paying European tariffs if they are not part of a free trade agreement with Europe. But it's simple. It's quite simple, too, to go to WTO tariffs. That, too, could be, that's sort of the default position. That's what happens if you don't agree to continue with the status quo. And all the talk about having to rejoin the WTO and so on is complete nonsense. We are a member. Look at their website. It lists us as a member. So the WTO system is simple. Both are simple. Both are acceptable. I would prefer to continue with the status quo. And I asked a room full of my colleagues in the House of Commons, some of whom were passionate Remainers, some of whom were Leavers, some of whom were pretty lukewarm on either side. I said, are we not all agreed that we prefer to continue trading with our European neighbours without tariffs and with no new barriers? They said yes. I said, right, so there's unanimity on that. But we should also be clear that we can perfectly well trade on a WTO basis, to use the shorthand. And we can do so because the average tariff on our manufactured exports will be some 2.5%. There are higher tariffs. The highest important tariff on manufactured goods is on cars, which is about 10%, nearly 10%. And there are higher tariffs still on some agricultural products. If you include agricultural products, the average goes up to 4%. But we've just experienced a 15% improvement in our competitiveness through the movement in the exchange rate. And by contrast, continental countries have experienced a 15% loss in competitiveness because of the reverse side of that exchange rate movement. We would enjoy 15% improvement less any rise in tariffs. They'd have to put up with a 15% increase in their cost of their exports plus any increase in tariffs. So we can live with it, just as most countries in the world do trade on the basis of WTO tariffs. And it's very important that we make that known. Johan was an experienced businessman, and he made it clear. He's, and most business people I know how to negotiate. And you can only negotiate satisfactorily if you are prepared to walk away with no deal. And we must make it clear that we can. And we can, and we will thrive and prosper if we do. There is a tendency to assume that trade deals are the be and all of prosperity. Actually, trade deals are of limited importance, and they're least important among developed countries because the tariffs tend to be low. They're of most advantage if you're negotiating a trade deal with a country or large and fast-growing country with still a high degree of protection, like India or China or whatever. But even there, one shouldn't exaggerate the importance of trade deals. And I say that as someone who's got a vested interest in the importance of trade deals, as I'm the only remaining parliamentarian who's ever been involved in one, the Uruguay round back in the 1990s, the last successful international trade deal we were involved in. But they're less important. If you look back even to the impact of our membership in the EU when we joined in 1972, it didn't produce a dramatic rise in our prosperity. There was a shift in trade away from the Commonwealth and towards the EU. But come 1976, we had to be bailed out, and the biggest bailout there's ever been by the IMF. And come 1978-9, we experienced the winter of discontent. So it didn't produce paradise on earth. Joining the EU, even if on the whole it might have been marginally beneficial from an economic point of view. The idea that leaving is going to cause hell on earth is equally silly. The Uruguay round, which was the last major trade agreement across the world, which sliced tariffs, particularly through, again, between developed countries. You look back and see what impact that had on growth worldwide. It was too small to measure. In the long term, it's probably been beneficial. But it doesn't produce a profound beneficial shock to the economy, moving to trading on WTO terms won't produce a profound negative shock to the economy. People will adjust. So it's very important we simply say to our continental partners, there's a choice. Trading on the basis of no tariffs and no new barriers, or going to WTO tariffs. Which do you want? There's an illusion that everything depends on what we choose. Not just in this area, but almost every area. There's still this sort of hangover from when a quarter of the world was painted pink, that British people tend to assume that everything depends on what we do. And the bourgeois sense of guilt means everything bad also depends on what we do or don't do. Actually, I've got news. There are other countries in the world and other people, and they will take decisions too. And on this issue, essentially, we can offer a choice. We can say we can live with either outcome. We'd prefer continuation of tariff-free trade and no new barriers. But if you wish, we will operate on the WTO basis as America, China, Russia, and others do. Up to you. And there's nothing we can do to bargain about that. All we can do is try and persuade, to point out that they will be the big losers if they insist on imposing tariffs, particularly, as Johan said, the German car industry and car workers, the French wine growers, the Italian luxury goods makers, the Dutch cut flour exporters, all those. They will be the losers. And that's the reason I believe we should move on with the process ahead of elections on the continent. Because the only people who will be wanting to go to the less attractive of those two options, particularly for them, are those who want to punish Britain, who think that if they punish us enough, we might change our mind, or even failing that, they need to punish us to stop anybody else following our good example. They don't actually normally call it a good example, but by implications, they're saying it would be a good example if they didn't punish us. It would be so attractive that others might follow. Which group wins on the continent, whether it's those who believe so powerfully in the creation of a single integrated Europe that it's important to punish us to prevent anyone else thinking otherwise, or those who are interested in the material self-interest of their own citizens. Which predominate will only depend on how persuasive we are, not how we negotiate. And we should be going around and pointing it out before the elections, that if a politician stands up in France, I've had a house in France for 30 years, I know, if you stood up in France and say it's important that Britain bears a cost for their reckless decision to leave the European Union, you'll get a cheer. And if you say, and we should impose tariffs on them, they'll probably get a cheer. And then someone say, but will that mean they'll impose tariffs on us? And you say, yes. You'll get boos, because then they know that their jobs will be at risk. And twice as many jobs will be at risk on the continent as at risk here. So all we can do is offer calmly and thoughtfully a simple choice. So we want to continue with the optimum solution, which is tariff-free trade, but we're prepared to go with Plan B, because we will still be better off and we will still have the opportunity there to negotiate free trade deals with the 60% of our trade and rising, which is outside the EU. Just one further thought. There is a tendency to say, well, we should bring back into the negotiations freedom of movement. Glad that the Prime Minister's ruled that out. But it's a mistake to imagine that that's a magic elixir. There are only three reasons why countries in Europe are in favour of free movement, or could be. One is a belief in sort of international liberal ideal that there should be no barriers to movement across the world. That's not the reason that the EU has free movement within the EU. They have no intention of removing barriers to free movement at the external borders of the EU. The main reason that people on the continent created this doctrine of free movement is that they believe they are creating a single country called Europe, and within a single country you have free movements for its citizens to move, work, travel and everything else. We are no longer going to be part of that embryonic country, and therefore we will not... There's no particular reason for them to want free movement with us unless they think that we can be lured back in. They required free movement of the Norwegians and the Icelanders and the, to a lesser extent, the Liechtensteiners, because they were countries whose governments were trying to negotiate entry to the EU, but whose people were a bit reluctant and they thought they could sort of be nudged in. They were in the ante-room, we're in the departure lounge, and there's no similarity and parallel. So, the three reasons you might be in favour of free movement are internationalism, the EU's not interested in that. Creating a single country, we're not part of that. Or, on a pragmatic basis, if you're an Eastern European country or Southern European country, you might want opportunities for your unemployed, and there are disgracefully high levels following the euro of unemployment in Southern Europe as well as in Eastern Europe, to come and get jobs in the UK. But that's a comparatively minor pragmatic thing. They're mainly concerned about the people that are already here, that they should not be evicted, and we should give that assurance, as I said earlier. So we shouldn't imagine that playing the free movement card will actually win much for us, unless we say that's part of our re-entry into the European Union and we're sort of keeping one foot in there. A sort of hokey-cokey Brexit. You take your left leg out, you put your left leg in, you take your left leg out, you shake it all about. No, we don't want a hokey-cokey Brexit. We want a straight, clean Brexit. And that's what we're here to discuss today.
Well, thank you, Peter, for bringing so much clarity to this issue that can sometimes seem overcomplicated. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's your turn to put questions to our